Welcome to Khetz Tutorials, and in this video we'll be talking about yet another looping structure. And in the previous video we talked about for loops. So the looping structure that we're going to talk about in this video is called a while loop. So let's name our file while.py. Okay, so that is our file. So what are while loops and how are they different from for loops? Okay, so let's get right into it. Now, while loops do the same thing as for loops. They loop around or they repeat statements a bunch of times. Now, what's very important when you deal with loops is you have to figure out where am I starting and what determines when I stop. So now, as the name kind of gives it away, we are continuing while something is true. So this is the syntax. You have while, then you have a condition, and you have a colon. Down here you have a bunch of statements which are indented. So now these statements will execute as long as the condition that is specified here is true, right? And another important thing is your while loop does not count or it does not change any variable like the for loops. Remember, the for loop, you had this, then a variable, then a condition, or whatever it was that you had here. And this variable was incremented by 1 by default, or you could specify what you increment or decrement that variable by in some other space. Now, when dealing with while loops, the while loop itself does not increment or decrement any value for you. You have to do it yourself inside the code and not at the definition of your while loop. So let's summarize how while loops work. Now, to summarize how these things work, you're going to say while, that's how you start it. Then you're going to have a condition, which is usually made up of comparison operators. So you want to compare a variable or you want to compare a state with some predefined value. And as long as this condition is true, these things will just loop or they just continue over and over. As soon as this condition that you specify there is false, now the code will proceed to any statements which are below the while loop. So if this doesn't quite make sense, or even if it does, let's just get right into the code. So let's define a variable called x. X can be anything, and let's start it off at 0. Then we're going to have our while loop. So I'm going to skip a bunch of lines. Start it. This is how you start it. You're going to say while, then have some condition, and this condition can be anything, but in our case we want to use the variable x as a checking point, something that we use to check if a condition is still true. So we're going to loop or we're going to continue executing the code that is in here as long as x is less than 5. Now, if you look at this and remember that pass is just will allow the code to pass without doing anything. Now, if you look at this, this is everything that you need to know, or this is all that a while loop is. You have this statement that defines the while loop and the condition. Then you have a bunch of statements, and the statements can be as many as you want them to be. And the important thing is, as you can see, there is nothing that specifies that we are either adding to x or subtracting from x. So there's no condition or there's nothing that actually changes the value of x. If you set your while loop up this way, it will loop forever and it will never leave the while loop. So how do you actually make sure that your while loop ends and it goes to the statement that comes after it? So let's say print outside, and that would mean outside while loop. So we can have that. Now, if I run this code, it will never print this outside while loop because there's no condition that changes the value of x, which is currently 0. So it will be 0 forever. So we have to do something that actually changes it. Just for experimental purposes, I can just show you. So we can say in while loop. So let's run a print statement inside and outside. So if I run that, we expect this to print forever. Okay. So as you can see, it's just going on and on and on and on, and it's scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, which is just basically going to stop it. Let's just Control C, cuts, which just cuts everything. and now it's out of there, right? If you look at this, we can even scroll up. It was just going to print this forever. I'm basically scrolling up, even though it doesn't look like it. If you look on the right, I'm actually scrolling down, scrolling up. So it will just print in while loop forever. That is not what we want. We want to eventually leave the while loop. So what you do is you will change the value of x. You can either increment by 1, increment by 2. You can't multiply by any value, because if you were to multiply, but multiplication, you could multiply this by any value, by 2, any value from 2 onwards, or a value greater than 1, and it would change the value of x each time. So you can do any operation that changes the value of your variable that's in the condition. It doesn't necessarily have to be addition, but addition is quite simple. And it actually will allow us to investigate what's actually happening in our while loop. So let's see the changes that actually happen when we do this. So let's run this and see the difference from. All right, cool. So there's our output. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in while loop statements or lines, and we finally have that statement which is on the outside of the while loop. So the statements that are inside the while loop are indented. These are the statements that are inside, they're indented. And the statements that are outside are actually outside the while loop. You can see this is outside the while loop. And we actually did say that it's outside the while loop. So how many print statements did you expect? I should have asked you that question. So we got 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the question, how did we get 5? How did we actually count? So let's have a look at what actually happened in the while loop, or how it's actually looping around. So the initial value, or the starting value, was 0. So when we entered the while loop at this point for the first time, x was 0. So it did the check. It said, okay, is x less than 5? It is. So it will run through these statements. It will increment the value of x. So x will now be 1. Then it will print this, which is in while loop. It finishes all of the statements. Because this is the last statement in the while loop, it will go back up to check the condition. Let's check our condition now. The value of x is now 1, okay, and is 1 less than 5? Yes, it is. So we go inside the loop once again, we increment the value of x with 2, we print again, so we're at this point now. We print again, we go back up to check the condition up here. Is 2 less than 5? Yes, it is. We consider 2, okay. We go back inside, increment, we have 3, print, then check the condition again. Is 3 less than 5? Yes, it is, so it's included. Go back down, increment the value of x. It's now 4, print the in while, which means we're now down here. It's now 4, 4 is less than 5, that is true. It increments, it prints, and this is where we are right now. Then after that, we have a value of 5. Is 5 less than 5? And the answer is no. So since the condition fails, it will not execute these statements inside. And so 5 is not included. It then exits to come out to outside while loop, and that is where it prints that. So if you look at the value of x, just like in the case of for loops, x takes on the values 0 through 4. But if we were to make a physical count, how many times did we actually loop? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Even though x goes from 0 to 4, we actually looped 5 times. So when you're dealing with lists, when you're dealing with loops and stuff like this, you start counting at 0. So if you include 0, you'll have 1 less as your maximum. So even though this loops 5 times, the actual value of our condition is 1 less 5, which is 4. So that is how the loop works inside or internally. And that is how you basically set up your conditions. And this condition over here doesn't have to be less than sign. It can be a greater than sign. It can be an equal sign. So just go back to that video that I made that talks about comparison operators. I can link it on the top right if you haven't watched that. So those comparison operators actually help you to check your condition. And as long as the condition is true, the while loop will execute. As soon as the condition is false, it will exit the while loop. So that is all with regards to while loops. I hope you liked the video. If you did, just give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.